Welcome to Ethical Voices, a weekly podcast where real pros share real stories about real ethical issues. I'm your host, Mark McLennan. Joining me on this week's episode is Elizabeth Pecsi, APR Fellow PRSA. She's an award-winning public relations and organizational communication leader with business and industry-specific experience in animal welfare, technology, energy, professional services, and is currently an adjunct at San Diego State University. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I am doing just fine. It's almost summer. Weather's beautiful. You can't complain.
There you go.
So I gave a brief overview, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your career?
I always think back on how did I come into the field of public relations? And I have to tell you, it was all due to a class in college. I was looking for what to major in after being a psychology major, and I read Cutlip and Center, and I fell in love, and I've been in the business ever since. As you already described, I've worked in agency, nonprofit. Most of my career has been in the corporate environment with an internal communications perspective. And why did I go into the internal communications perspective of public relations? Really stems from having worked a lot with media and realizing that an organization's reputation, brand, etc., is as strong as its people. And so for most of my 30 plus years, I've worked with leadership on corporate messaging, internal, so it's consistent with external, really looking at being consistent in what we say and what we do. Now I can take that into the classroom and share those experiences with students.
That's great. And one of the reasons I invited you is I haven't had enough people talking about internal communications. Thinking over your career, what is the most difficult ethical challenge you ever confronted at work?
This is a really good question. And I mean with some weight to it, because being in a corporate environment, there are a lot of requirements that, especially a public company, there are a lot of requirements for a public institution that you have to make sure that you're aware of and that you're complying with. I think back on my career in internal communications and working with the news media at the time about an example where our company, which was a large utility, private and publicly owned, was making some changes in the way that it was going to run the utility. And I had quite a number of good relationships with the news media. And of course, you're kind of familiar with them and they're kind of saying, hey, why don't you tell me about this? I understand that there's some changes going to be made in terms of how, you're going to be running the business. And I'm thinking, oh, this is really open or it's conversational. And I realized, wait, I have to be very careful here because since we were a publicly held company, there are SEC requirements that needed to be complied with. So this particular reporter kept kind of poking me, saying, hey, you're my buddy, can't you give me some insight on this? And I was like, I thought, no, I really can't. And it was a very awkward situation because I was friends with this person before the situation came up. But I realized that the risk and responsibility outweighed doing, something that you kind of think, okay, in a friendly environment. I think that for me, what that taught was the importance of knowing what the boundaries are in terms of what you can and cannot disclose. Along those same lines, you can't disclose information internally before it's externally shared if you're a governed company. And so the timing on how do you set up your communications to disclose to your employees information that will go public kind of at the same time, concurrently. And there are ways to do that, and learned how to do that, working with legal, working with human resources, and also working with the news media.
I think that's a good point. And one of the things I talk about is when it comes to compliance as a public company, there's definitely challenges. And in some ways, utilities, financial services, and pharma, while there's more restrictions there, In a way, it helps set the lines brighter than in some of the other industries like technology or consumer goods, where there's more gray room. And so, how do you recommend people educate themselves about where the ethical lines are?
I think the best way to educate yourself about where those ethical lines are kind of like just best practices to begin with. They're kind of like the fundamentals. Like, you speak with your legal counsel, especially if you're new in your position. I'm not talking about someone who's been years in this business, but if you're just starting off or you're kind of like in your mid-career and you haven't really worked, let's just say for a publicly traded company, a good place to start is just go and have a good conversation with the legal counsel to understand what are the requirements for a publicly traded company. Of course, you can always take a workshop, LinkedIn has learning sessions. I mean, there's books and all kinds of other ways to educate yourself. But I think that number one is a good place to start. Second to that is really within the human resources, because there are governance with regards to disclosing employee information. I've not worked in the healthcare industry, but I know that there's a lot of compliance and requirements around, patient information. So I think it's starting with those core organizations who are responsible for ensuring that an organization is complying and doing the right things. And then if and when you have to act, that you go to the table with that knowledge and start to look at what you can and cannot say. So I think about, like, in this past couple of weeks in San Diego, we've had a hospital who was taken down by ransomware. And not being in the organization, but it was very clear to me that the organization was not publicly communicating about, what they could and couldn't say. And oftentimes you can say things publicly like, hey, we can't talk about the ransomware and what's happening with that. But what we can tell you is here's what you need to do for accessing information or making appointments, or et cetera. Again, that messaging external has to be what you've already told employees internally. And that is, again, from that ethics perspective, that's being forthright, being able to honestly say, here's what we can talk about and here's what we can't talk about.
Thinking beyond your own personal examples, what are you seeing as some of the key ethics challenges for today and tomorrow?
I think some of the key ethical challenges, probably in the past and today and tomorrow, is really always knowing your facts, never speaking. Keeping the goal of the business in mind and never speaking about something that you don't know the facts. In other words, be honest that here's what I can tell you, here's what I do know, and to be able to say, well, I don't know, or I can't share information about that right now, and to hold your ground on that. And I think that a key lesson or key challenge is always to be trustworthy. When you tell somebody you can't tell them, I've seen this with employees, when an executive stands up in front of employees and says, I can't talk about the details of this deal right now because of our responsibility to our shareholders and to other constituents. But here's what I can tell you. And I can also tell you that when I have more information, I can follow up. People believe in that. And that's that trustworthy, that's that honesty. And it's not speculating and fabricating what could be. So I think those challenges, Mark, are not going to be too much different in the past, in the present, and in the future.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you're right. It is that honesty and being clear and focused on what you can say. Is thinking as you're talking to students at San Diego State University, what are some of the ethics issues that most engage them?
Today's students are very sharp. They can kind of see through, I would say, sort of fronts. So I think that the ethical issue for students today is somebody being honest, when they're speaking up. the other side of that is I worry that that students are not looking broader than just people who are saying what they want to hear. Okay. And I think that's, again, why I think disinformation, misinformation gets them riled up, but they are limiting themselves by not going out and really researching it or listening to other opinions. So they'll jump on the bandwagon versus maybe step back and think about it, question it, explore it. Again, I'm making some broad generalizations. I wouldn't say that all students are like that or all those things kind of get them going, but I find that the authenticity, the give me a voice, listen to me, those are things that kind of get them going.
I was talking to Jim Hogan a few weeks ago, and he was bringing that up about the challenge of people self-selecting and really breaking into more tribalism right now as being a key challenge. And now he gave some great advice about that. And thinking about advice, what is the best piece of ethics advice you were ever given?
I think two things probably, Mark, for me was I remember a vice president I worked for, and he said to me, whatever you do in your career, always remember to stay focused on the goals of the business. That is your responsibility. And you really need to weigh what you do and you say and you plan, against the goals of the company. Along with that was really be absolutely able to substantiate your actions. I think those have been big influencers in my life, in my career, when looking at my role as, communications director, coordinator, whatever, is just to remember the goals of the company or the organization. I mean, people always think companies are money makers. Well, nonprofit needs to make money to stay in business too,
Absolutely.
And to be able to substantiate what you do and what you say.
As a mutual friend of ours has said, a nonprofit is a tax status, not a mission.
That's right. You got it. So true.
So is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to highlight, Elizabeth?
I would just like to say to listeners that it's also very important for all of us to always be weighing what we're saying with what we're doing and to do it with responsible thought and action. And ethics is kind of tricky. It's not always black and white. So I think when in doubt, talk to somebody or check it out, right?
That's great advice. Yeah. And thank you, Elizabeth, and thank all of you for listening. You can visit ethicalvoices.com for additional content and subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Google Play. You can reach us at McLennan at ethicalvoices.com or follow me on Twitter at McLennan. And remember, to quote Roy Disney, it's not hard to make decisions when you know what your values are. Thanks. Have a great week.